statecraft, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to QI's Veterans Day panel, an event that derives from a book, recently published book, Paths of Dissent, which I co-edited with Danny Sherson. Danny is a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm a veteran of neither one of those, but he and I recruited a group of vets from the post-9/11 period to reflect on their experiences in our recent wars. And we're privileged today to have with us 4 of those veterans who contributed essays to the book. Let me introduce them to you briefly. They are, first, Jason Dempsey, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Jason served as an infantry officer during his military service, deploying twice to Afghanistan, once to Iraq. His last post was as Special Assistant to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Jason has written extensively on various subjects. Most importantly, in my judgment, he is the author of a book called Our Army, an important study of civil-military relations. He will be followed in the order by Gil Barndollar. Gil is a senior fellow at Defense Priorities. From 2009 to 16, he served as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps and deployed twice to Afghanistan. He also is working on a book, this one examining, to my mind, what is one of the most understudied and important subjects in American politics, and that is the all-volunteer force and conscription. Third will be Joy Damiani. Joy is a writer, podcaster, and musician, served 6 years in the Army as a public affairs specialist to include 2 tours in Iraq. She has a new book out today that you will want to check out, and the book has a much better title than any book I ever wrote, If You Ain't Cheatin', You Ain't Tryin', and Other Lessons I Learned in the Army. So you want to check that out as soon as we're done today. Last in the batting order is Erik Edstrom. Erik graduated from the military academy in 2007, then deployed to Afghanistan, where he served as an infantry platoon leader. His book, Un-American, is a highly regarded social commentary and memoir, which I also recommend. I don't know why, Erik, but today I went to your website and you have what is absolutely the most dynamite author photo I have ever seen. So the rest of you who are working on books, check out Erik's author photo. He has set the standard a very high bar. Okay, that's who's with us. And I am going to start things off by doing the jump ball question, and we'll let Jason have the first whack at it. It's probably a mixing of metaphors. It would throw the jump ball and then have a whack at it. And the question is this: how did your military service change your outlook on citizenship, on war, and on America's place in the world? If time allows, we're going to let folks who are watching ask questions, but for right now, let's let the panelists have their say. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and I appreciate you hosting this and these other questions. It's an honor to be contacted and are calling in today from Columbia University and the Center for Veteran Transition and Integration, where we're looking to hope really engage in a lot more of these questions because we need more of this discussion. And I would say, to answer to your question, what it taught me about citizenship is be engaged, be critical, and be questioning. One of the things about America today is I think that we've forgotten that American citizenship is both an honor, but it's also an incredible burden. And you can't celebrate citizenship without undertaking some of the discomfort required to make sure that we remain an exceptional country. In that it's not enough just to take from the riches that America has to offer. It's not enough just to say, well, I'm part of the greatest fighting force on earth, therefore honor me, as some are wont to do on a day like today. But it's always asking the question, to what ends are my service? How are decisions being made? And are we doing something at the end of the day we can all be proud of and all of us take accountability for, versus just saying, well, I did my little piece. It's okay if everything's going off the rails. I'm going to take mine and go home. And so citizenship is an obligation to work and to question what your government is doing and to stay engaged, not just for your own interests, but for our collective interests.
Excellent opening statement. Let me do one quick follow-up. As you have watched the brouhaha related to the recent midterm elections, do you come away from that encouraged or discouraged about what's happening to the prevailing conception of citizenship?
Yes and no. All right. I think there's two different threads there. I think that a lot of pundits did Americans a disservice by saying this was all just going to be about gas prices and not realizing that, no, Americans, when led, do care about the health of democracy. They do care about fundamental rights, and they're willing to be engaged, and they're not simpletons who can be manipulated on the basis of what may or may not be in their paycheck. Most Americans realize that there's much more at stake than that. And so there's some hope from these midterm results that reinforce that. Where I am distressed is that what we've seen, particularly from veterans during this election cycle, is a willingness to superficially use the label and identity of a military veteran in a way that's very corruptive to American civil society. They are riding that wave of American fantasies about what the military can do and what it should do. And unfortunately, there's a lot of folks who think that America or the American military will be the savior of democracy, which is, of course, antithetical to everything that America has been built upon. And so to see some veterans take advantage of the high approval ratings of the military, to seek and to pursue authoritarian principles in an effort to gain personal power or to say that we've got the right answer, fundamentally undermines the very principles of what makes America an exceptional country. So a little bit of good, a little bit of bad. On the whole, though, I think we can fight back against the bad.
Very thoughtful. Thank you. Gil, what's your view?
Yeah, well, let me just say that I agree 100% with Jason, especially the last point he made there. And it is, I guess at this stage it's not shocking, but it's sad when you see veterans in particular being often, in many cases anyway, at the forefront of call it what you will, misinformation, disinformation, kind of sedition, skinny dipping, and that's particularly kind of offensive to me, I guess, and it's sad that's becoming an increasingly common feature of sort of American political life, especially within the veterans community, in as much as there is such a thing. But yeah, as far as my service and what that left me with, it's kind of, to me, a mixed bag. I think that on the one hand, military service in the U.S. all-volunteer force, and we could probably talk about this more later, but that's a bit of a misnomer. It really is an all-recruited force. You've got people there for an awful lot of different reasons, and some good and some bad, but everybody sort of step forward, but for a variety of reasons. That being said, I think that even though very few people are actually sort of volunteers in some kind of prosaic, charge up San Juan Hill, not that that was a great thing, but not in that kind of sense. Having said that, there are an awful lot of good people, wearing tree suits every day, and hundreds of thousands of more. Same thing on, weekends and drill periods, and reservists who then go overseas a lot of the time and do the exact same work. So that's really encouraging. It leaves you, and I was someone that came in a little bit later. I took a weird path to Marine Corps and commissioned just before turning 28. So, I was about a decade older than the average Lance Corporal in my platoon. And there are a lot of good folks. You have your 10%, superstars, and your 10% that probably shouldn't be there. But that stuff's really encouraging, just from a generational perspective, as a guy who's right on that millennial Gen X cusp. I do think, as I said, the AVF, I think, is really become part of the problem. I understand why we went to that. I understand why the draft broke and the historical legacy of that. But my time, the project I'm working on now that Andrew alluded to, it was a direct outgrowth of trying to look at our military From that perspective, having been in it, seeing how limited that system is and seeing how much it gives, and plenty of people have written scads about this, and I think it's becoming, maybe slowly, if I'm optimistic, more of a feature of the American political discussion, at least on the margins. But we have a system where the majority of Americans have no skin in the game, despite being functionally an empire, functionally for the time being the dominant world power. Whether political scientists will debate a multipolar versus a bipolar world and where we are, where we're going, but still the dominant military power on Earth, and the vast majority of this country does nothing except kind of passively pay the bill, and really only pay the vast majority of us only pay the bill financially and in a kind of unseen way. So I think that's a real problem. I don't necessarily, we're not going to we don't need to draft 20 million Americans or anything. That's not in the realm of the possible or the desirable. What we have now, I think, isn't working. The all-volunteer military, depending on how you do the math, is at best kind of 1 in 2 in winning wars, and if you want to be less charitable, it's 1 in 8 or 1 in 10. And I think that record means something. So, I would just close by saying that as far as our place in the world, I think my time overseas, especially in Afghanistan, but in kind of peacetime deployments as well, reinforced both how over-militarized our foreign policy is, how over-militarized our presence around the world is in a lot of ways, and at the same time, what the limits of military power are. I mean, I think when you're sitting at some remote patrol base or combat outpost in Afghanistan, and you realize the limit of American power is eyesight or computer-aided eyesight, and all you can really do is kill things. I mean, that's essentially your ability to influence things. It is kind of atavistic. You do feel, maybe in a slightly romantic way, but mostly in kind of a hard, depressing way, a little bit like a Roman. Those tropes get rolled out, but I think in most ways that's a negative. So I think you see the limits of how we've done business, what we are, and what a lot of our power and influence in the world is.
Thank you. Early on, you used the phrase sedition skinny dipping. And I just want you to know I may well steal that.
By all means.
It's very evocative. Joy Damiani, can you give us your views?
Hi, yes, I can. And I guess I should start by saying when I first joined the military, I had no real, I had not put much thought into what the military was, what the United States is. And it was in the course of, my 6 years in the military and then the, 14 years since then, has basically caused me to call into question everything that I was ever told. And a lot of things that make fellow veterans uncomfortable. Like, I don't think of the military as a service to anyone. I think of the thing that I came away with is that the United States military is the largest terrorist organization in the world, and it's the largest polluter in the world, and it's the largest exploiter of well-meaning individuals in the world. I really appreciate the things that Gil is saying about the all-volunteer military, because years ago I wrote a piece about this called Nation of Apathy, kind of making the satirical argument that we need to bring back the draft so that people pay attention. But really, what I believe is that we need to abolish the military, because what I see it as a continuation of what this nation was founded on, which was genocide and slavery and exploitation and white supremacist patriarchy. I mean, I think it is very. When I walk into the room as a veteran, I'm regularly, one of the only non-males in a space that where veterans are, like, here we are today, because it's, we're fed. When I was in the Army as a public affairs person, my job was to help create the narratives that kept the other soldiers fighting, right? To mix the Kool-Aid, essentially, right? Like, I consider myself as having mixed Kool-Aid in the belly of the beast, because it really, I was trained to say things like, we're winning hearts and minds, we're the good guys, we're victorious, when really all we are is invaders and occupiers of everywhere, including the nation that we claimed that we stole from indigenous folks and built on the backs of slaves. The United States military has always been an extension. It's been the authoritarian arm of American exceptionalism, which is, I think, one of the most toxic mindsets plaguing the nation. It's why when I go out and speak about my military experience, people tend to bristle when I say, don't thank me for my service. It wasn't a service. I was suckered into this job because the recruiter saw that I had no path toward higher education. I had no other, jobs available to me. There's no other way to get, your education and your healthcare paid for. I saw the all volunteer military as being, the all deceived military and the all exploited, either because we're led to believe that we are doing something heroic by putting on a uniform and following the orders of people who don't care about us or anybody but themselves, really, when it comes down to it. I served Dick Cheney, really, is what I looked at it as in the military. I didn't fight for anyone's freedom, but the military industrial complex's freedom to exist. And, it's the thing that has hurt almost the most is since I've been out, hearing people thanking me for that, it puts an immediate barrier on what my actual experience was. When people thank us, what they're saying is, I'm not interested in hearing what you actually went through. I'm interested in feeling like a good citizen. And the fact is that nobody should be thanking veterans. We did a job. We did like the worst paying job in the nation, right? And we followed orders to endanger and deceive and manipulate and exploit other people just like us. And when we get out of the military, we're told, oh, you did a wonderful thing. You're a hero. We respect you. But I don't feel that I did that. I think the people who stayed out of the military and went to work in schools or went to, do literally anything that actually helps people. They're the ones that we need to thank. And so I would say being in the military and and then getting out of the military opened my eyes to just how many layers of deception happen in this nation and indoctrination and programming, and how difficult it is to resist that programming and to say, actually, no, don't thank me. Question this system. If you want to show appreciation to people who have been in a war, first of all, pay attention to all the involuntary veterans and all the places that we've invaded and occupied, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, all the places that we're bombing by proxy, right? All of our quote unquote allies are fellow terrorists. We're not making life better for anyone anywhere in the world. And there's no better, spotlight on that than to see how our military, how our government treats us when we get out of the military and basically sends us out onto the street and says, good luck. If it hadn't been for my own tenacity and my own willing desire to get out of that mindset, I could have easily been one of those, ranting veterans on the street, just like shaking my fist and yelling at the air about how, the government hates us and we've all been tools of the system. But instead I wrote a book and now I get to talk about it to people instead of by shaking my fist in the air.
So your critique would be the right term, more fundamental, I think, than what we heard from Jason and Gil. As you assess the temper of the country, are you hopeful that your critique will resonate and gain some purchase? Or, these are my words now, but or do you feel, like an outlier?
Oh, I definitely feel like an outlier. I mean, most people are not ready for this conversation. When I say the only way forward is to abolish the military and use the money for things that actually help people, I mean it. I mean, I see, my experience in the military as a femme person, as a non-binary femme person, I was treated horribly by my fellow soldiers. I was sexually assaulted by men who I looked at as my friends, in a war zone where I couldn't get away. You know what I'm saying? I still had to go to work and be around those people. I see the United States military doesn't even care about the people in it. So how can it possibly care about anyone anywhere else? That's where I came to. And no, most people don't want to have that conversation. It's hard. Cognitive dissonance is a bitch, sorry, pardon my language, but like people do not want to be in a world where the most powerful force in the world is the bad guys. But that's what I felt we were. That's what I was paid to. I was paid to be a deceiver. So when I look at the way the tide is turning now, in some ways, I think people are angry. I think people are desperate these days. We're dumping all this money into the war machine, and so, like we could literally like close down one base in the world and feed and house everyone here. But we've chosen not to do that because we are a militarized nation. We are war makers in this country. That's what it is. And the only way that we'll ever be able to pull ourselves out of this cesspool that our politicians of all colors are, of all political persuasions are dragging us into, is to call the whole system into question. We don't live in a democracy. Our military is not good guys. We're not, and once I think it's hard to acknowledge that, but there's a lot of freedom in it, to be like, oh, I actually don't have to believe this narrative that I was sold. And once I came to that, that was extremely liberating. And I feel like a lot of people, um, in this country, once they're, everyone's struggling to survive right now and feed themselves and house themselves. But like part of the reason why it's so frustrating and so demoralizing all the time is because we're being told to not believe our eyes and our ears. If we look around and we see who the dark side is, it's us. We are the empire. We are stormtroopers. That's what we were. And we want to think of ourselves as like being the rebels. Like we're not. Those of us who stand up and say that we don't buy into this system, we're ostracized and castigated, and there's no room for us in polite society. So yeah, I think that the only way forward is an acknowledgement that it was all built on white supremacy and imperialism and genocide and slavery, and to acknowledge that we've literally never had a representative democracy in this nation. It's always been built on oppressing the people at the bottom so that the few at the top can thrive. And I feel like it liberated me a lot to be able to just say that out loud and see it, and to resist all the conditioning otherwise.
Erik, where are you on this?
Yeah, we have a group of panelists that have contributed to the book. The book is, of course, called Paths of Dissent. And when I think about dissent, it's sort of a function of two things. One is freedom of speech and having the ability to speak out. And the other is having the moral courage to do so. And so I think, and I hope that this group has served as examples using their military experience to express a perspective on dissent as it pertains to the military and also our country's relationship to the military. So it's really, it's two different things as well, that you're critiquing not only the apparatus, but the way in which we as citizens engage with the military and think about it. So I think that it's both of those things. I also think that it's extremely helpful. America is better off when there is a competition of ideas, and dissent is incredibly important as a part of that. If you do not speak out, you're not going to achieve the change that you hoped. One of my past employers actually referred to it as an obligation to dissent, that it is not about a freedom to, it is not about a choice. It is that if you see something wrong and I hope this could be used in a civic sense as well. If you see something wrong as a citizen, it is your obligation to attempt to right it. And it is your obligation to speak out, because if you do not, it will continue. And if it continues, bad things happen downstream. And so that engagement at the top part of the funnel is most important. And when I say top part of the funnel, I'm talking about the strategic thinking before any decision is made. And so you need to get involved in that loop at the top end, especially because the best execution on a shitty plan isn't going to yield particularly good results. If you engage early and often before decisions are made as citizens and help change the direction of those decisions, you have an ability to, even with an average execution on a good plan, that's far better results. And anyone here who served on front lines in the military would know that, having a base at the bottom of a bowl of mountains, no matter how well defended that is, it's strategically incompetent. And you could zoom out a bit further to take that to a macro level of our country at large. And so when I look at the war on terror, it is a strategically stupid decision. And so you look at it and you say, over the past 20 years, what did we get from it? Well, everyone's heard the numbers of $8 trillion or so, a tremendous amount of money leveraged in debt against the future prosperity of American citizens. We caused over 100 9/11s of civilian deaths across the greater Middle East. Thousands of American soldiers obviously died in combat, and thousands more killed themselves afterwards as a result of suicide. And I've had one soldier in my platoon who was 18 when he deployed. He killed himself when he was 19 or 20, about 18 months after he got back. So this touches me personally. I had about 25% of my platoon became casualties when I was deployed to direct combat in Kandahar province, Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010 as a young platoon leader. And I realized during the course of my service that we are trying to solve the absolutely wrong problem the absolutely wrong way. And so we've done this for 20 years, and this is going to be some of my most inflammatory comments, so buckle up, is that you have to think about this in sort of a first principles approach or root cause. And you look at this in the rearview mirror and you say, how is it possible that we didn't see this coming, that we continued to devote ourselves to a negative sum war where year after year we dump more resources, more people, and get worse outcomes, ending in a shambolic removal of troops from Afghanistan and embarrassing our reputation once more on the national stage and international stage for that matter. And so it brings you to a split dichotomy of options. On the one hand, our generals and our political leadership did see it coming all the time, or they didn't. So let's start with the latter. Let's just assume that political leaders and generals year after year didn't see that this being a negative sum war, and that they continued to devote troops to this absolute debacle. When you go to the root cause analysis, either that means that the people we put in these positions of power as admirals and generals are absolute dimwits, that they go into the funnel and they go to institutions like my own at West Point, and they are just not very bright people. They just do not see it coming. Or is it that the institutions are so educationally bereft and barren that they can't teach first principles problem solving to these otherwise bright people, so that when they go into positions, they realize that there's something wrong and they can see it, they'll speak up. So either we have dimwits in positions of power, the institutions that we spend billions of dollars standing up, like the Naval Academy and West Point, don't do their job and don't educate the future officer class, or there's the other side of the equation, which is that they did see it coming and they knew year after year that this was a lost cause. And if that is the case, well, then you have two other problems. Either it's a violation of your moral code, the West Point honor code itself, which is to not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. They're actively lying about false progress. So they've been lying to the people year after year. Or they don't have the moral courage to stand up and say anything about it. And no matter what the outcome is, this should require an absolute reckoning over the entire system of how the US operates as a military. And either the generals need to be removed because they're dimwits, they are liars, or they lack the moral courage and fortitude to say that this doesn't work and this plan shouldn't work, and actually put their career on the line and say, no, this isn't right. So 3 out of the 4 options, they should all be fired. And we should do a congressional investigation as to why this is the case and why we promote the wrong people. Or is it a matter of the institutions themselves give you the education of something less than being a Deloitte first-year analyst in terms of problem solving? So what is it, America? We need to look at this as a larger problem with our ability to engage in conflict. And this needs a complete overhaul. So I yield the stage back to you, Andy.
Well, I thank all of you for those provocative comments. And I certainly won't attempt to summarize them. But it seems to me that the overarching theme, expressed in different ways, is one of systemic failure. I mean, Joy, I think, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Joy would say the systemic failure goes all the way back to 1619. Maybe Erik would say it goes back to 1802 when they founded the military academy, where I also went to school. But systemic problems are tough to solve. I think I would argue, and this is a shallower critique than we heard from Joy and Erik, but maybe it connects with Jason's perspective. I would argue that the systemic issue centers on the all-volunteer force. And the way that the all-volunteer force, at least in my judgment, is one factor that undermines a meaningful conception of citizenship. Now, as you know, as anybody tuned into this discussion knows, we got the all-volunteer force as a response to Vietnam. We had relied, maybe from Joy's perspective, in undertakings that were unworthy, but we had relied on citizen soldiers to do the dirty work of the empire. And it was the abandonment of the citizen soldier concept, the embrace of the all-volunteer force as a consequence of Vietnam, that to a very large extent, not completely, but to a very large extent, that I think got us where we are today. In particular, got us to where the fundamental critique that is needed is simply not heard. Certainly it's not heard in places like Washington. So my question for the 4 of you, and with your indulgence, perhaps we can do this again in the same order, is what's the alternative to the all-volunteer force? And how, as a practical matter, is that alternative to be implemented? And Joy, if you will forgive me, I would ask that when you answer the question, give us more, please. Give us more than simply abolish the whole damn thing, okay? So let's take on the all-volunteer force. And Jason, you're up first.
One, unfortunately, I don't think there's an easy solution to it. We've talked about national service. We talk about how do you get the public engaged. I think we're going to find out without being proactive what it means to not really have the all-volunteer force as it is that I think this has largely been an experiment in that classic phrase of it's easy to be stupid when you're rich. And America has been wildly rich and wildly stupid for the last 30 years. And so we've allowed these foreign policy escapades to progress with a sense of indifference. And, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of these problems stem from the advent of the all volunteer force, because I think what happened, and as I write about in the book that everybody should buy, Paths of Dissent, I think when that went away, we moved from having an anti-war, pro-war, anti-military, pro-military camps. The spectrum of conversation entirely shifted. We no longer had anybody who was anti, we only had people who were indifferent. And that was the worst case scenario, in that Americans had the privilege then to just not care about what the military was doing. They weren't being asked to do anything about it. They weren't asked to pay taxes. They weren't at risk of being deployed. So, and oh, by the way the military is structured, we all said things were going great, and we were enjoying our time overseas. So, who am I to question as a standard citizen? More disturbingly, of course, with the collapse of confidence in all of American institutions and the military lagging behind that, we don't even have pro-war or pro-military anymore, but we have this spectrum of unquestioning fandom, whereby a lot of Americans have projected their fantasies about what it means to be a citizen upon those in the military, because they don't see anything else, any other examples around them. And unfortunately, those are fantasies not grounded in reality, but they're leading young men to confuse costume play as soldiers domestically, with the obligations of citizenship. So I think we're about to find out that the military, the last hope, is not going to solve America's problems. And I think we're going to find out through being a little bit more poor, a little bit more disheveled, that all of us have obligations to citizenship beyond just pinning our hopes and dreams on the military.
Excellent. Gil?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple things to that. I mean, I would offer a slight corrective, and I know, Andrew, you know this, and everybody in the panel does, but we've traditionally gone away from an all volunteer, again, an all recruited military in times of crisis, right? So, and peacetime conscription was a post Cold War innovation. That was unprecedented, right? We had a draft and draft riots and everything came with that in the Civil War, and then during World War I, along with a lot of crackdown on domestic dissent, and then World War II. And then peacetime post World War II, right, for what we saw as the twilight struggle, the kind of global challenge of checking Soviet communism, right? So, the kind of my forebears, I guess, in the Marine Corps that fought the Banana Wars, that was an all recruited force, a small all volunteer force that did a lot of other things in the name of America, and sometimes in the name of American empire and American commerce. So to those, I would just say the country's done questionable things with its military without having, while still having AVF, previously. But all that being said, I guess it's kind of a binary thing. We are having a recruiting crisis now, and I think there's, it's starting to get attention. It's drifted above that, kind of broken the waves, and starting to get mainstream kind of press attention and maybe even civilian attention. I don't think that's going to go away. I know part of it, the narratives around it, a lot of them are probably false. I think a lot of it is the change to the medical software they're using, the Genesis system, which basically means you can't hide medical stuff you weren't supposed to be hiding anyway, right? So in theory, DoD is getting what it always should have gotten in terms of fidelity on the medical status, mental and physical, of its recruits. But we're realizing that's a problem. They're having a problem filling the ranks. So we can keep throwing more money at the problem that has diminishing returns, and I think we're running out of room. As Jason said, we're running out of money as a country, or certainly the amount of wealth we're used to having. So that's one option. The other thing, I guess, would say if there is an American exceptionalism, and I'm an opponent of it as a concept, and I think it's led to a lot of evil and a lot of stupidity and a lot of problems in just a basic conception of who we are as a country and as a people. But there is one really exceptional thing about America, and that's its geography. I mean, the country is and has been for well over a century surrounded by friends and fish, right? That famous line from the French ambassador has been dead about a century. So that's a real thing. This country could get away with a much smaller, a tiny military, no military, but a much smaller military, probably a pretty big Navy, if it wanted to. But that would lead to a lot of changes, a huge diminution in what we can do in the world. Maybe most of us on this discussion might be very sympathetic to that, or at least would want to engage with what that is. But the vast majority of certainly the governing class and kind of The movers and shakers in American society are not probably ready to engage with that conversation. So absent that, we're going to keep having a big military, and I think we're going to struggle to man it with an all volunteer and all recruited force. As far as if we were to keep the military its current size and keep the level of American engagement and military engagement in the world, the best system I think that works is a selective conscription system, which is basically what the Nordic countries all do. The Finns are an outlier in terms of universal male conscription, but the Norwegians, who are also very wealthy, the Finns and the Swedes and the Danes all do a basic version of that, where they have a draft on the books. Everyone is theoretically obligated to serve, but they only take, give or take 10% of a year group of 18, 19-year-olds coming out of high school are actually going to be put in uniform. In theory, that's the best of both worlds. You're not getting too many really unwilling people that have to serve in uniform, but you are maintaining that critical legal and kind of ethical obligation to serve. But we're a long, long way from even beginning to broach that discussion as a country.
Thank you. Joy.
Yes. Wow. I'm really happy to be in this conversation. I would say when I look at what's working and what's not working, I look at it as like what do we see in this what do we see as a functioning system, right? In this nation, we like to say like, oh, the system is broken because it's not working for the people. But when we look back at the history of this nation, we see that the system that we are in right now is actually the system that was created, and it's functioning correctly. It's exploiting, it's oppressing, it's seizing power. That's what the United States has historically done. We are the power seizers. We are the genociders. We are not the good guys. And so, when you look at empires, historically speaking, they last a few hundred years and then they collapse, usually because they think they're too big to fail. You like ask the Ottomans, right? So when I see our way forward in this nation, I see the only way forward being to call into question all of the principles that we have been taught that this nation was built on, and see that the way to actually build a society, and like, I'm not even talking about a nation, because and there's something in my eye, I'm not like that emotional. I mean, I am emotional, don't get me wrong, but it's early yet for tears. I see it as we need to imagine what a world looks like that is actually based on the ideals that we claim to be fighting for: egalitarianism, for the average person to be able to be happy and healthy and thriving, right? So that's why I say maybe it sounds flippant, but I'm very serious. Abolish the military, and we need to take the money that is being pumped into the war machine, which is what it was always intended to do, right? The military has always been intended to perpetuate the war machine. That's why it's like, that's what it does. It's not going to not do that, no matter whether it's volunteers or not, whether people are dragged in off the street. The point of the military is to intimidate and oppress and to perpetuate war. That's what we're doing. So if we don't want a society that's at war, the last thing we need is a military. What we need is well-trained and fed and housed and educated human beings who know how to live in community. I won't say communism, but we need to live in community, right? Because capitalism is what's killing us. And the United States has always been built on capitalism and imperialism. So when we look at this system, we look at this military, like, it's doing exactly what it was built to do. It's not going to not do that. It's what it does,
But let me play the devil's advocate just for a moment. If your prescription were implemented, how would the rest of the world respond? Or more specifically,
oh my God, I'm sure they would be so relieved.
Hold on just for a second. Yeah. How would the People's Republic of China respond? How would Vladimir Putin respond to the announcement that
I mean, this is
there is no U.S. military. There is no force that whether it's a fiction or not, there is no force that claims to defend America. What would be the response?
Well, first of all, I would say we have no right, honestly, to exist as a nation. So, this idea that we should defend our right to exist as a nation is already rooted in an exceptionalism that we haven't earned. Um, but I would say,
You're skipping past my question.
yeah. So, okay, I think that first of all, like when we look at like sort of the boogeymen, right? The China and the Russia, and those are manufactured threats, right? Like Russia and China have never invaded us, ever, and what they are doing, what China is doing is essentially what we would be doing if we didn't weren't dumping all our money into the military. It's dumping its money into scientific progress and into creating some kind of society for people at home. It's focusing on home, and the reasons they go those nations go to other places is to not to take over other places necessarily. I mean, all governments are corrupt, right? All superpowers are wrong. So I think
But you're, in other words, but forgive me for interrupting, because we have to let
totally.
Erik get have to let Erik have a shot. But if we embrace peace,
Mhm.
so too will everybody else. Is that the bottom line of the argument?
The bottom line of the argument is that like we're not even capitalisting smart, right? Like if we want to have happy, healthy, thriving people, the last thing that we need to do is invest in death and killing and oppression everywhere. No other nation has a base in the United States. If it ever tried, we would declare war on it. But that's what we do everywhere. We have bases everywhere that are just trying to maintain this semblance of power. And so, what if we woke up in the morning and the government was like, you know what, we're not funding the military anymore. We're just going to give everybody a universal basic income to feed themselves, house
But Joy,
themselves.
that's what I'm asking you. If that what if came to pass, then how would we? What would be the response of
I mean,
others
I
who
would
may
say
not be favorably disposed toward us?
the thing is like we are the bullies, right? Like we create enemies. We aren't just like the good guys and so the bad guys hate us, right? Like we're the bad guys too. So when you look at like what the other bad guys response would be, it'd basically be like we took our ball and we're going home. We're not playing this game anymore. This game of war, of ongoing perpetual war. Instead, we're taking our resources and we're using them to create a population that is actually better at working and more desirous of working to help one another and to build one another up, because we're not being fed this like specter of an enemy that's like looming and waiting to take over. Like, no, we manufactured that threat, and we manufacture threats all over the world, and if we don't see a threat somewhere, we drop a base there, and now all of a sudden they're a threat too.
Let's,
So it's like that's my thoughts.
I understand. Let's let Erik have a shot.
Yep. Well, Joy, I would imagine that proposal would go down far worse than even defunding the police as a fringe view that would never get approved. I mean, whilst I agree that the U.S. military is overreaching massively and not doing what its role and scope should be, I think the notion to abolish the military altogether would be absolutely fringe and wildly unpopular across the United States. And I would be wholly in favor of defense of the national territory and what the purpose of the military should be, rather than exploits and wars of aggression. But that's very different in terms of scope than abolishing the military altogether. But getting back to Andy's comment about the all-volunteer force, a couple things that I was thinking of. This sort of, without going into a bachelor's of science in PPE at Oxford for politics, philosophy, and economics, there's always going to be tension between collectivism and individualism. And the notion that you'd have sort of a planned economy where the state is going to be able to say that you are going to have to give up your body and join the military is obviously wildly unpopular for anyone that's an individualist and believes in free choice. That being said, there's probably some things that could be done to change sort of the way that the all-volunteer force is done today. One of which would help avoid exploitation, especially exploitation of the bottom 50% of the socioeconomic bands, would be to get rid of the notion of a contract in the military, where if you are being deployed to a combat zone and you disagree with the war because you have learned information throughout the course of your service that this is an unethical or immoral war, and you are able to quit your job just like anyone else can quit their job in the private sector and say, nope, I'm opting out. I'll serve here stateside. I'll do something here. That's fine, but I'm not going to your war. I'm not participating in that. Or even just to leave altogether that you don't want to support it in any context, whether that's loading ammunition in the United States to be shipped overseas. You don't want to be a part of it at all. If you had the optionality to leave, then what that would do, it would have the functional sort of shift where the military would have to pay more to its people. You'd have to, if people could leave because they didn't believe in the war in which they were serving, the military would have to increase wages to people and give them better benefits, because it's harder to attract people to fight in a war of aggression than it is to attract people when they are actually fighting a war of national defense. If my home state of Massachusetts, if Boston were attacked tomorrow and there were divisions of troops, bombing Quincy Market, although there isn't particularly many good food trucks there anyway. But any sort of situation like that, you'd have numerous people that would volunteer at no salary or low salary. But when you're talking about something so completely divorced from reality as the argument that we are in Afghanistan to provide protection for people at home, that would require the military to pay more. And so conflict would become more expensive the more morally dubious it is, and therefore put some additional pressure on the military to only wage wars that are actually germane to the national security of the territory itself. So that's one thing you could do. Another thing, which I would absolutely love, would be to raise the standard of living for the bottom 50% of America, because then it's no longer an issue where they are joining the military for dental coverage, as you might hear, these sorts of things where I join the military because you have a child at home and you need childcare. It's no longer joining the military because you don't have other options that allow you to survive. It's actually joining the military as a choice. And if the floor were raised so that we provide a standard issue of dignity to all Americans so that they don't have to worry about healthcare, and we're not talking about Gucci health services, just basic care, then the military would be a less attractive option. So that's another thing. And then my more inflammatory option would be because, if we're talking about the importance of having affirmative action in the military, and that we believe that race is important and we should be looking at having the composition of the military represent the composition of America at large and basically represent that, we should also be talking about diversity in terms of economic class. And where there's a lack of diversity, the top 1% joining the military. So if we want to have true diversity across classes and across race, across religion, if that's what affirmative action is about, we should start drafting the top 1%, children of the 1%. If there was such a thing like that, very quickly, wars would become a lot less popular if actual children of the super wealthy are being involved in those conflicts most directly and bearing the brunt of those costs of war.
Erik gets to a point that always gets me pissed off. What do we got? Like 5 graduates of Harvard per year that are being commissioned.
Oh yeah,
through
I did hometown recruiting
ROTC.
actually, Andy, for the MIT branch of ROTC, which was sort of hilarious. It was basically General Petraeus's son and like 3 other blokes. That was about it. And it was like Harvard, MIT, like Suffolk, Tufts. It was like, the Paul Revere Society or something like that of the ROTC branch. And it was like,
I think they called it the Paul Revere Battalion.
That's right. Yeah.
Even though it consisted of about 6 ROTC cadets.
Yeah, it wouldn't even fill a platoon at West Point. And it's like 6 universities.
Although, Erik, let us not hold up the United States Military Academy as a model.
Yeah.
I say this as somebody who attended the place half century ago. Now, we're running out of time. So let me try to wrap things up and wrap it up most importantly to thank all of you for what really has been a provocative and interesting discussion that I think that folks tuning in will have benefited greatly. I've been getting a series of questions from some of them, which I'm not going to be able to pose to you because we're out of time. I apologize for that. But this is more than fulfilled, I think, our expectations at the Quincy Institute for what a Veterans Day event ought to do. So we're greatly in your debt. By way of wrapping up, I've been asked to issue a reminder, and that is this coming Monday, the Quincy Institute will be hosting an event under the title, Is America Ready for a Multipolar World? And the answer is, we damn well better be. So this event will go from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. I'll read you the text here. The U.S. position as the world's superpower appears to be slipping. Editorial comment, no kidding. Chinese power and reach continues to grow. The global South has adopted an independent position in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And as world leaders gather at the G20 summit in Bali, Americans' power and purpose are at the crossroads. So the purpose of this event on Monday, again, from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., is to consider some of these questions. I hope folks who are with us now will join in with that, get the word out so that we can have a good discussion. Again, thank you for joining us. Thank you especially to Jason, Gil, Joy, and Erik. Remember to buy Joy's book for participating. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.